Baltimore, November 1969. A heavy gray sky pressed down on the red brick rooftops of the city's southwest side. In the early winter chill that cut through layers of clothing, one all-girls Catholic school continued to ring its class bells with regularity. Archbishop Keogh High School was more than just a place of learning. For over 100 young girls, it was a haven amid a turbulent time in America. The Vietnam War raged abroad. Protests spread across the nation. But inside those quiet school hallways, a different kind of violence was creeping in. Silent, systematic, and hidden by the very people who wore robes of faith. Catherine Sesnick, or Sister Kathy, as everyone knew her, was 26 years old, beautiful, warm-eyed, with a gentle smile. She taught English literature, but more importantly, she listened. To her students, she wasn't just a nun. She was a mother figure, a confidant, someone who dared to ask the questions adults often avoided. On the evening of November 7th, Sister Kathy left the small apartment she shared with another nun, Sister Helen Russell. She said she was going to buy a loaf of bread at Edmondson Village and stop by a gift shop. But Kathy never came home. Her green Chevrolet was found the next morning parked not far from the apartment, its door ajar, the interior undisturbed. No signs of struggle. No witnesses, no message. In the days that followed, the Baltimore community was shaken. Students were afraid. Where had Sister Kathy gone? Who would want to harm such a gentle, kind-hearted woman? The church remained silent. Police had no solid leads. But some of the students knew. The answer might lie deep within the walls of Keogh itself, where a horrifying secret had been festering for years. Nearly 2 months later, Kathy Sesnick's body was found in a garbage dump in Lansdowne. She had been struck violently in the head and left in the cold woods to rot. Her death did not just mark the end of a life. It marked the beginning of a decades-long battle for justice. A battle to expose predators hiding in faith's disguise and the powerful forces that helped conceal their sins. This is the story of Kathy Sesnick, of quiet bravery, of terrifying silence, and of the young women who finally dared to speak when no one else would listen. On November 7, 1969, the skies over Baltimore were the usual pale gray, cold settling in like a second skin. But inside the senior English class at Archbishop Keogh High School, something felt unusually warm. Sister Kathy walked into the room with a faint smile and a copy of Romeo and Juliet in her hand. Her light brown curls peeked from under her veil, her black habit simple and neat, and her voice, calm, measured, felt more like storytelling than lecturing. She spoke of love and tragedy that day, but her eyes held a sadness deeper than the text. Later, many of her students would say they sensed something unspoken behind her gaze. There was a tension in the way she walked, carefully concealed beneath kindness and poise, but present all the same, like someone bracing for something she couldn't name. When the bell rang, some girls lingered behind as they often did. One of them was Jean Hargadon Vayner, a name that would become vital in the investigation years later. Jean remembered the way Sister Kathy looked at her that day. "Are you doing okay?" she asked, gently placing a hand on Jean's arm. Jean smiled and nodded. She had no idea it would be the last time she'd see the woman who had quietly saved her soul. Around 6 p.m. that evening, Sister Kathy changed into civilian clothes, a common practice for teaching nuns living outside the convent, and left the small apartment she shared with Sister Helen Russell at the Carriage House Apartments. She mentioned she'd be picking up a loaf of bread and a small engagement gift for her sister. Her aging green Chevrolet Nova rumbled to life under dim streetlights before disappearing into the chilly Baltimore streets. As night fell and Kathy hadn't returned, Sister Helen began to worry. They had lived together for years, knew each other's habits. By 9 p.m., Helen stepped into the hallway, hoping to see headlights in the parking lot, but only wind and shadows greeted her. She called a few acquaintances. No one had seen Kathy. The next morning, what they found chilled the blood. Kathy's Chevrolet Nova was parked just a few blocks from the apartment. The driver's door was slightly ajar. Inside was a loaf of bread still in its bag, but no Kathy. No purse, no sign of a struggle. No blood, Baltimore police were called, but their initial response was indifferent. A grown woman missing. Maybe she left voluntarily, maybe it was personal. What they didn't understand, or refused to, was that Kathy Sesnick was not the type to disappear into the night. She wouldn't abandon her students. She wouldn't fall silent. What the police and the church didn't know yet was that Kathy had seen too much. When police began investigating Sister Kathy's disappearance, all eyes within the Catholic community turned toward Archbishop Q High School. But contrary to what her family, friends, and students had hoped, the church's response was disturbingly cold. No public appeals for help. No organized prayer vigils. No pressure placed on police to prioritize the case. Amid the growing sense of tragedy, those in authority maintained an eerie silence. 4 days after Kathy vanished, something strange happened. Sharon May, a former student of Kathy's, happened to pass a vacant lot near Lansdowne and noticed the strong stench of decay. She reported it to police, but no one came to investigate. It wasn't until nearly 2 months later, on January 3, 1970, that Kathy's body was finally discovered. In the exact same area, just off Monumental Road, only a few miles from where her car had been found. Her remains were badly decomposed, nearly unrecognizable. A man foraging for wild berries in the woods made the gruesome discovery. Forensics determined she had been struck in the head with a blunt metal object, fracturing her skull. There were no signs of sexual assault. But one detail wasn't released to the public. Her body had been carefully arranged. Her legs were straight, hands laid at her sides, as if someone who knew her had placed her there with care. The press exploded with the story. A young, beautiful nun found murdered in peacetime suburbia. It shocked the city. But just as quickly, something seemed to clamp down on the case. No arrests, no suspects. No one in the church was thoroughly questioned. Students began whispering to each other. Something terrible had happened. And Kathy may have known too much. Among them was Jean Vayner, the student who had once shared a deep bond with Sister Kathy. Throughout high school, Jean had been sexually abused by Father Joseph Maskell, the school's chaplain. Not just her, but many others. Kathy had been the first person Jean ever told. She didn't judge me, Jean would later say. She just listened. And I knew she wouldn't stay silent. Kathy told Jean she planned to do something. That she would take action. Just weeks later, she disappeared. Helen Russell, Kathy's roommate and the last known person to see her alive, was never deeply questioned. The church intervened early. The archdiocese's attorneys were present at every interaction with police. Internal records were never released. Investigators began to retreat from the case, citing lack of evidence. Meanwhile, back at Keogh, Father Joseph Maskell continued to say Mass, lecture from the pulpit, grant confessions, and quietly destroy the lives of girls behind closed doors. Sister Kathy's shadow never left the halls of that school, but the crimes stayed dressed in robes of faith. More than 2 decades had passed since Sister Kathy Sesnick was found dead, yet the case remained classified as unsolved with no significant leads. The files sat untouched in the archives of the Baltimore County Police Department. No one had been charged. Father Joseph Maskell lived peacefully, quietly transferred between parishes, even spending a short time in Ireland before returning to the U.S. Meanwhile, the girls who once cried in Kathy's office, who came to her seeking refuge, carried their trauma into adulthood like invisible scars. But memory never truly disappears. It sleeps, waiting for the right moment to awaken. In 1992, Jean Vayner, Kathy's former student, began therapy for escalating anxiety and panic attacks. During those sessions, memories came flooding back. Vivid recollections of being sexually abused by Father Maskell. It hadn't been isolated. It hadn't been private. There had been other adults involved, people with power, policemen, doctors, church officials. Jean had buried it all, convinced it was some kind of hallucination. But one image stayed with her. Kathy's face, that last time in the classroom, half lit by the afternoon sun. Then came the most terrifying memory, one that had haunted her for years. Jean recalled how Maskell once took her for a drive into the woods outside Baltimore. There, he pointed toward a decomposing body. "See that?" he said. "That's what happens when you talk." Jean believed the body was Sister Kathy Sesnick's. But she had been 16. Who would believe her? After years of silence, John decided to come forward. In 1994, she filed a civil lawsuit against the Archdiocese of Baltimore, revealing her real name and recounting in graphic detail what had happened to her and others at Kiowa. But the court dismissed the case, citing statute of limitations. Maskell was never criminally charged, but public attention began to mount. Months later, another woman named Teresa Lancaster, also a former Keough student, reached out to Jean. She too had been abused. She too had once confided in Sister Kathy, and she too had been threatened by Maskell. Two women, independent of each other, telling matching stories down to chilling specifics. The church denied everything. Maskell insisted on his innocence, claiming, "These girls are fabricating lies to damage the church." He hired lawyers, refused interviews, and continued living quietly in a suburban home near Baltimore. But the truth had begun to leak through the church's stone walls. More former students stepped forward after reading Jean's story. Some spoke of being taken to a soundproof confession room. No windows, no witnesses, no oversight. By late 1994, Father Maskell had quietly fled the U.S., relocating to Ireland. On immigration forms, he wrote he was taking medical leave. But back in Baltimore, a storm was gathering. And after more than 20 years, the name Kathy Sesnick was once again back on a detective's desk. When Father Joseph Maskell left the United States in 1994, many believed he would never return. But just 3 years later, under growing pressure from survivors and media attention, Maskell unexpectedly came back to Baltimore. He claimed he was willing to cooperate if necessary, but refused any formal questioning by police. For the remainder of the 1990s, he lived in seclusion, no longer performing Mass, no longer engaging with parishioners, yet still supported by the church with housing and financial aid. In 2001, Joseph Maskell died from complications of a stroke at a nursing home in Carroll County, Maryland. No criminal charges had ever been filed. No one had been prosecuted for the death of Sister Kathy Sesnick. Once again, the case was shelved, reduced to faded paperwork and the unbearable silence of the survivors. It wasn't until 2016, nearly 50 years after Kathy's disappearance, that the case was suddenly reopened. The catalyst came from an unexpected source, a team of independent filmmakers working on a Netflix docuseries titled The Keepers. The investigation, initiated by former Keough students Gemma Hoskins and Abby Schaub, reopened every dusty corner of the case. They interviewed dozens of former witnesses, sifted through police and church archives, and slowly, new leads began to surface. During filming, Jean Weiner and Teresa Lancaster came forward publicly for the first time, revealing on camera the full extent of the abuse and trauma they had endured for decades. Their accounts, consistent, detailed, and deeply emotional, shocked viewers. People began asking hard questions. Why did Kathy die only weeks after learning the truth? Why hadn't the church conducted an internal investigation? And who had shielded Maskell for so many years? These questions put real pressure on Baltimore County Police, who reopened the investigation in late 2016. One of their first steps was to obtain a court order to exhume Joseph Maskell's remains for DNA sampling. This happened in secret in February 2017. Forensic technicians retrieved samples from his femur and molars. The DNA was then compared with a sample collected from a rape victim in 1969, the same year Kathy was murdered. The result came back negative. It wasn't a match. For the public, it was a disappointment. But for seasoned investigators, a lack of biological evidence didn't clear Maskell. He could have been the orchestrator, not the one who did the actual killing, one retired detective remarked. What we need isn't just DNA. We need someone to talk, someone who knows the secret. After The Keepers premiered on Netflix in May 2017, public reaction exploded. More survivors began to come forward. Some were in their 60s, having lived their whole lives in fear. One woman recalled being drugged by Maskell, only to wake up and find strangers in the room. And Kathy had known. Kathy had comforted them. Kathy had asked questions. And for that, Kathy had to die. But Kathy's murder was only the beginning. The rest was a sprawling system of silence and protection, one that had existed for over 4 decades, unnamed, unchecked, and unresolved. After The Keepers premiered, hundreds of thousands of viewers across the United States began sending letters, emails, and messages to the filmmakers and the Baltimore County Police Department. But it wasn't just outrage and sympathy pouring in. Among them were messages from women who had once walked the halls of Keogh, who had confessed in the same small rooms and who remembered the same voice, Father Joseph Maskell. One woman, known only as Mary, her name changed for protection, wrote that in 1969, at just 14 years old, Maskell summoned her to his office during school hours. He told her, "God wants to cleanse you," then injected something into her arm, leaving her disoriented. When she awoke, her blouse was undone, and 2 strange men were walking out of the room. "I didn't know who they were," she wrote, but Maskell stood there, praying the rosary like nothing had happened. Mary had never told anyone, until she saw Jean Wehner's face on Netflix. Mary's story was not unique. Another former student, Linda, remembered that Sister Kathy once called her aside after class and gently asked, "Are you okay? Is something scaring you?" Linda hadn't been brave enough to speak then, but Kathy's eyes seemed to already know the truth. She didn't push, didn't pressure, just left her with a single sentence, "If you ever need anything, I'm here." And that, Kathy's quiet presence as a safe harbor, made her a threat. Multiple former students recalled that Kathy had voiced concerns about Maskell to the school administration. A week before her disappearance, she was believed to have visited the school's records office to review lists of girls who had met with Maskell in private. Another teacher, unnamed in the official files, later confirmed that Kathy had seemed anxious and uneasy in her final days, but never said why. If Kathy had begun collecting evidence, then she was holding secrets capable of toppling a system. Meanwhile, with the influx of new testimony, investigators began cross-referencing old abuse cases from the late 1960s. A disturbing pattern emerged. Most of the abuse occurred at Keogh during Maskell's tenure, with a consistent method: drugging, isolation, religious intimidation, and the frequent presence of outsiders. One of those outsiders was mentioned repeatedly, a police officer named Charles Franz, known to be a close friend of Maskell. One survivor recalled seeing Franz in uniform at the school late at night. When questioned, Baltimore police declined to comment. The deeper they dug, the wider the circle of victims and protectors grew. Kathy, even in death, appeared to be the only one who had tried to fight back. And now, the students she once quietly protected, the frightened girls who had huddled behind classroom doors, were stepping forward into the light, finally saying what Kathy never got the chance to. Following the explosive success of The Keepers, the case of Sister Kathy Tesnick caught the attention of international media. Major outlets like the New York Times, CNN, BBC, and The Guardian published in-depth investigative reports dissecting not just the crime scene, but the powerful forces that had remained silent for nearly half a century. Kathy's name, once a faded note in an aging police file, had now become a symbol of courage against institutional corruption cloaked in religion. But at the heart of the storm, the survivors felt differently. They weren't seeking headlines. They wanted answers and justice for the woman who had once placed a gentle hand on their shoulder and asked, "Are you okay?" Jean Wehner said in an interview, "We're not doing this just to expose Father Maskell. We're doing it to give Kathy her voice back. She listened to us. Now it's our turn to listen to her." The most crucial question remained: who killed Kathy? Jean believed Maskell didn't act alone. In her memory, when he drove her to the site of the decomposing body, another man had been in the car, silent, expressionless. Many suspected that man could have been Charles Franz, the police officer and Maskell's longtime friend. But there was no physical evidence. No DNA, no confession. Franz had died in 2005. In August 2017, a new witness came forward. Her name was Lillian O'Donnell, now living in Florida, who had worked as a substitute school nurse at Keogh in 1969. She claimed that in October of that year, just weeks before Kathy disappeared, she saw Kathy leave Maskell's office with red, tear-filled eyes. "I didn't know what they talked about," Lillian said, but she was holding a thick folder, and her hands were shaking. If Lillian's statement was true, Kathy may have gathered student records, potentially damning evidence of Maskell's confession sessions. But those documents were never found. They may have been destroyed. Or perhaps they still sit in an inaccessible storage room belonging to the Archdiocese of Baltimore, which has never allowed full outside review. Meanwhile, journalist Tom Nugent, who had investigated Kathy's case for 14 years, claimed someone within the church once quietly told him, "Kathy wrote a letter to the Vatican." If true, that letter could hold the final key. But despite numerous legal efforts, the Vatican has refused to release any documents related to Kathy Sesnick. At this point, much of the legal battle had shifted to civil court. Several survivors filed lawsuits against the Archdiocese, seeking restitution and accountability. But the church opted for quiet settlements, never admitting wrongdoing, only sharing in the pain. Each victim received between $50,000 and $100,000 in exchange for an agreement not to pursue further legal action. For Jean, Teresa, and the dozens of other women, money was never the goal. They approached the truth the way one might visit a grave, not to claim victory, but to honor a promise. "We made a vow to Kathy," Jean said, "that if she couldn't speak anymore, we would speak for her." And they kept that vow. In 2018, a year after the Keepers shook the world and public outrage reached its peak, a sobering reality set in. The murder of Sister Kathy Sesnick remained officially unsolved. No indictments were made. No new suspects emerged. The Baltimore County Police issued a vague statement saying they were still investigating, but offered no tangible updates. Slowly, the public began to understand that the door to legal justice, at least in the formal sense, had quietly closed. But for the survivors, truth was still alive. It lived on in nightmares, in flashbacks, in the uneasy stares of strangers. Jean Vayner once said, "Justice isn't a conviction. Justice is remembering Kathy not as a body in the woods, but as someone who lived, who fought, who gave everything." Teresa Lancaster recounted how she had to move 3 times in as many years due to threats from radical church loyalists. Some continued to believe that women like Jean and Teresa were fabricating stories to destroy a priest's reputation. One day, Teresa received an unmarked envelope in the mail. Inside was a photo of Kathy and a scrawled note in black marker, "Shut up or join her." Still, they did not stop. In 2019, Jean and Teresa spoke at a public forum at Loyola University in Baltimore, sharing their story before more than 700 students. Many in the audience wept. A young woman stood up and asked, "How do you go on after everything?" Jean smiled gently and replied, "Because I don't go on alone. Kathy is always with me." When asked about Kathy's final hours, Jean always returns to a detail she can't shake. "I believe someone lured her out of the apartment with a plea for help. Kathy never said no to someone in need. I don't think Maskell killed her with his own hands, but I think he knew, and he may have sent someone." This led to a theory shared by several independent investigators. Kathy Sesnick may have been murdered by someone within law enforcement or someone with the authority to cover their tracks. People like Charles Franz, if he were still alive, might have been a key witness or even a participant. But as these names passed away without ever being questioned publicly, the truth was buried with them. The deeper one digs, the clearer it becomes. Kathy's murder wasn't the work of a lone madman. It was the result of a rotten structure of power, where predators wore collars and those who dared speak were silenced, sometimes literally. One of the Keeper's producers once said, "We didn't find the answer, but we found the people." And sometimes the truth is in the pain they carry. In this story, truth didn't come with handcuffs. It came in trembling voices, quiet eyes, and memories that refused to sleep. By the end of 2020, a quiet cemetery on the outskirts of Baltimore, where Sister Kathy Sesnick was laid to rest, began to see unfamiliar visitors. There were no signs, no guided tours, just a simple patch of grass and a modest stone that read, Catherine Ann Sesnick, SSND. 1942-1969. The truth will set you free. Fresh flowers began appearing daily. An elderly woman bowed in silent prayer. A group of students left candles and photographs. Some had never known Kathy, but after watching The Keepers, they felt a moral debt. "We came to say she's not forgotten," one medical student wrote in a notebook left at the grave. Though no one had been convicted, Kathy's presence had become something more. A living memory, a quiet witness for an entire generation of women silenced by fear. And not just at Co. After The Keepers aired, Catholic schools across the U.S. saw former students come forward with abuse allegations. A wave of lawsuits erupted in Pennsylvania, Illinois, New York, and California. Cases that had been buried for decades were reopened. In that tide, Kathy Sesnick's case acted as a spark, a reminder that no covered-up death ever stays hidden forever. In 2021, a team of attorneys representing Baltimore survivors filed a petition requesting that the Vatican release documents related to Father Joseph Maskell, including appointment records, internal complaints, and files from 1965 to 1995. The Vatican refused, citing sovereign immunity and the principle of internal ecclesiastical confidentiality. According to an investigation by the Baltimore Sun, the Archdiocese of Baltimore had quietly relocated Maskell at least twice after receiving misconduct complaints. Both times he was reassigned as chaplain or priest without notifying parishioners. When questioned, a church spokesperson simply replied, "We deeply regret what happened, but things were different back then." It was that sentence that brought Teresa Lancaster to tears during a live interview. "Back then, we were 14 years old," she said, "and they left us behind." Across the country, Joan Vayner was now retired, living peacefully in a small New England town. Each morning, she walked through a park carrying a printout of Kathy's favorite poem, To Be of Use. It was the last poem Kathy had read aloud in her English class days before she vanished. "Kathy always wanted to be useful to the world," Jean said. And in the end, she changed it, with her death. But one question still remains unanswered. Who placed Kathy's body in the woods? It had to be someone who knew her, someone she trusted enough to follow, someone who, to this day, has never come forward. And even now, Baltimore has never spoken that name aloud. More than half a century has passed since the cold November night Kathy Sesnick vanished, and to this day, no one has been arrested, no one has stood trial, and no one has been officially held responsible. The case remains listed by Baltimore County Police as under investigation. But with each passing year, witnesses fade, records disappear, and justice, if it still exists, erodes like the moss growing over Kathy's headstone. Yet the most astonishing thing is not the system's failure, but the relentless strength of the women who once were its victims. They are no longer the trembling schoolgirls hiding in hallways. They've become mothers, advocates, educators. They stepped into the light not to reclaim dignity for themselves, but to prevent history from repeating itself. Jean Vayner continues to speak at universities, churches, and trauma centers. Teresa Lancaster became an attorney, dedicated to helping abuse survivors within closed institutions like religious orders. Both women kept their promise to Kathy to never let her death be forgotten. In 2022, a nonprofit called the Cessnick Foundation was established to support survivors of abuse within closed systems like churches, boarding schools, and cults. Its symbol: a single daisy on a black background, Kathy's favorite flower. "We cannot change the past," the Foundation's message reads, "but we can ensure silence is never again the only option." A few retired investigators, now well into their 70s, still follow the case in their own quiet ways. One of them is Tom Nugent, the journalist who has pursued Kathy's story since the 1990s. "I believe someone out there is still alive," he said, "someone who knows what happened. And maybe it'll take just one voice to break it all open." On a morning in October 2023, an anonymous letter arrived at the Baltimore County Police Department. Inside, a single handwritten line: "I was there. I can't sleep anymore." No signature. No return address. But the letter was immediately forwarded to the Special Investigations Unit. The Kathy Cessnick file was reopened once again. It may be a glimmer of hope, or it may be a cruel hoax. But for those who've devoted their lives to seeking the truth, even a sentence like that is enough to hope. Because in this story, truth has never come easily. It has been buried, manipulated, weaponized, but it has survived, smoldering, and it cannot be extinguished forever. Kathy Cessnick is gone, but her name, for millions, has transcended victimhood. She is a warning, a crack in centuries of silence, a young woman who chose to stand when others couldn't. And though her killer has never been named, though justice has never spoken aloud, in the memory of those still living, Kathy won. Not because she was vindicated by a court, but because she planted a seed that made an entire system tremble.